Shattering Myths. I am Yahowah. Each weekday here on GCN, we strive to expose the destructive myths associated with religion and politics, with patriotism in the media, and with military and economic schemes. Instead of merely presenting the news, our mission is to understand what is actually occurring while predicting how these events will shape our world. Then during our second hour, we will engage God on His terms through evidence and reason, since His is the lone reliable voice in an exceedingly troubled world. Our phone number for those who would like to participate in this discussion or to ask a question, toll-free 877-300-7645. This is just a throwaway story, but it does indicate just how sensitive Americans are becoming. This is, however, has nothing to do with the religion and has everything to do with the implement. It is as if a pressure cooker now needs to be regulated as liberals would like to regulate guns. Reuters. A Saudi Arabian man was arrested in Detroit and charged with making false statements about why he bought a pressure cooker and why it was with him on a flight from Amsterdam, according to a criminal complaint on Monday. So here's a Saudi Arabian man, and he's being arrested because he has in his luggage a pressure cooker. Hussein al-Yahowah, 33, arrived at the Detroit airport on Saturday and was questioned about why he had brought the pressure cooker with him. He initially told reporters that the pressure cooker was for his nephew, a university student in Toledo, Ohio. Now, you do have to wonder. Now, I have sold pressure cookers because I used to, back in earlier part of my life, I used to be a manufacturer's representative, which is the sales and marketing team for small and mid-sized companies that provide a sales and marketing function between those companies and retail chains, so chains of retail stores. And in that process, one of the companies I represented was Presto. Presto is probably the largest, if not the largest, certainly one of the largest manufacturers of pressure cookers worldwide. They are an American company located in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, I believe. And the product was really well crafted. And it has a value. The pressure cooker elevates the pressures within the vessel so that when put on the stovetop with various cuts of meat, typically mixed in with vegetables and broth, it has a tendency to do two things. One is it speeds the process of cooking, so it's not nearly as fast as a microwave, but it will reduce by about 30% the cooking time in an oven, and it is more efficient to heat the pressure cooker than it is an entire oven. And also, because of the pressures, there's this tendency to tenderize meats that would normally have to be slow cooked, breaking down the connective tissues in those meats. But the reality is a pressure cooker is a dated device in the sense that while Presto started in business making pressure cookers, they are far more famous now for other products, and the pressure cookers has become a fairly small part of their business. So to suggest that a Muslim student in Toledo, Ohio, was in need of a European-purchased pressure cooker is a fool's folly. Highly unlikely that a university student would be using a pressure cooker to prepare a meal. I mean, there are some university students that actually cook, but the likelihood of them using a pressure cooker to cook for themselves, incredibly remote. And then this story goes on to say, the defendant then changed his story and admitted that his nephew had purchased a pressure cooker in America before, but it was, quote, cheap and broke after the first use. That's also not true. Because of the nature of of American manufacturing back in the 1950s and 60s, back in the time that we actually made tools and dies, and we had large machine shops in America. We made extraordinary products. And so, having sold these pressure cookers, I can tell you that the quality of the manufacture, the quality of the materials, is rather extraordinary. That if it was being designed today, they would never be designed as well in terms of the quality of the materials, the thickness of the materials, as they were back then. And, you know, and part of this also is that a pressure cooker that is poorly made doesn't fail, it explodes. The failure of a pressure cooker that is not made well, that's cheap, will take out the house. It's like a hot water heater with a release valve failing. It becomes a bomb, as we saw in, although it was packed with explosives, not meat, in Boston. And so this idea that it was cheap and broke after its first use, absolutely impossible. Not the case, not even remotely the case. Then this article says that pressure cookers packed with explosive powder and shrapnel were set off at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. They killed 3 people and injured 264. And it is such bombs left on the ground in Islamic worlds are responsible for killing people and wounding them worldwide. So, you know, here's just an interesting insight. You have a Saudi Arabian man, 33, fairly young man, bringing in a pressure cooker, which he says is for his nephew, who is obviously a Saudi Arabian Muslim, in Toledo, Ohio, taking advantage of American education, and yet man thinks there's no problem with lying, number one, and no problem with providing his nephew with materials to build a bomb. So can I tell you that with absolute certainty that the purpose of the pressure cooker was as part of a bomb? No. It's just like when we first read the story of what occurred in Boston, and by the end of that first 24-hour period, there was a revelation that it was a pressure cooker that was used. By the time we got to that level of detail, and I put together all of the pieces, that it was a indiscriminate target, not affiliated with any particular group, that the bomb was carried in a backpack, that it was placed in a pressure cooker, that it contained nails and BBs or pellets, that it was set on a sidewalk, and the target was to mutilate young children as well as men and women. That when that evidence came out, the likelihood that it was perpetrated by Muslims was 99.9%, based upon any thorough investigation of what is occurring around the world. And so, with this, well, I can't say it's 99% certain that this was a bomb in the making. That is the very high likelihood. Moving on to our next story, speaking of bombs, Iraq has become a living hell. All thank you to the United States. You know, sometimes when you think that, well, I have justification for invading a country because its dictator is a tyrant, you ought to think about the consequence of how killing that one individual because you can might lead to a vastly worse scenario. And that's what we've created in Afghanistan. We made a bad situation infinitely worse. At least 42 people were killed today, and many others were injured in a series of car bombs and attacks in central and southern Iraq. Baghdad was worst hit with 8 explosions at bus stations and markets in the mainly Shia Muslim districts. You notice where those bombs went off. Bus stations and in markets. 2 bombs went off earlier in the day in the southern city of Basra, and a blast in Samarra killed 3 people. The attacks come amid a rise in violence in Iraq linked to growing political and sectarian tension. So when it comes to politics, now there is a term for political tension. It's called secular. But they didn't use secular because there's no problem using secular and political interchangeably. But if you're going to use political, the counterpart for political is not sectarian, it's religious. You can say, and be not being hypocritical, growing secular and sectarian tension, but political and sectarian tension says that I'm afraid to say the word religious. And it is wholly religious. Now, the fact that religions like Islam, in fact, all religions have a political component, doesn't change the fact that the motivation for the growing violence, the terrorism in Iraq, is religious. This is Sunni against Shia, Shia against Sunni. Police said that 175 people were injured in Monday's violence in Iraq. Now, think about the consequence here. 42 people were killed. I think another report says 43, and the number will probably be 50% larger as the data comes in, and more people who were in serious condition actually die. And so it'll probably be 60 people. And there were 60 people killed the day before, and the same number the day before, and the day before. We had 3 people killed in Boston, and we turned the entire city of Boston and its suburbs into a police state. Dominated the news for weeks upon weeks. Now, same perpetrator, Muslims. But just think about what it's like to live in an Islamic country. The bombs in Basra, and mainly a Shia Muslim area, killed at least 14 outside of a restaurant and a bus station. We were sitting there waiting for work, and as usual, we gathered near a street food cart, and the place was very crowded, said Muhammad Ali, who was near one of the blasts. Gee, I didn't know that Muhammad Ali was now in Iraq, but I guess he has moved. Or perhaps Muhammad Ali just picked a very common name among Muslims. We'll return to Shattering Myths. There's another explosion, this one in Dagestan, and another one also a story out of Libya of Muslims acting badly, which we'll address when we return to Shattering Myths after the commercial break. Good morning. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. I am your host, Yahowah. As promised, there are more stories to report about malfeasance in the world, particularly the propensity of Muslims to bomb. That's why it was so easy to identify the likelihood that the Boston bombings were perpetrated by Muslims. 2 car bombs exploded in Dagestan on Monday, killing at least 8 people and wounding another 20. Blast very similar to the carnage, at least, of the Boston Marathon. The blast occurred in swift succession. Same number of bombs, same duration of time between them. The bombs, which they are being told in this case were suicide bombings, this article says are routine in Dagestan. In other words, they happen every day. It's the same thing, by the way, in Kashmir, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, throughout much of the Islamic world, also in Yemen. These kinds of bombings take place multiple times every day. In a place like Iraq, for example, there's an average of about 20 to 30 bombings a day. And the only ones that make the news are those that just happen to be in a place that there are embedded reporters, or a place that America or Europe has been involved in recently, so there's some affinity for the country. But the vast majority of them go unreported. But there are probably on any given day several hundred bombs perpetrated by Muslims in various places around the world. There was a story out of Syria, both Syria and Lebanon, and most of the information about Syria is really coming by way of Lebanon. But this article from Reuters says that the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah, now, that would be like calling the U.S. Marines a Lebanese military group because they were barracked in Lebanon for a period of time before Muslims decided they would drive cars into those barracks and kill several hundred of them. But the fact is they're still United States Marines, regardless of what country they may be residing in. These are not, Hezbollah is not a Lebanese militant group. It is an Iranian militant group. But getting beyond the error of Reuters, we find that according to some reports, 30 of these Hezbollah militants and 20 Syrian soldiers and militiamen were killed in heavy fighting with rebels in the town of Qusar, Syria, activists said on Monday. Opposition sources and state media gave sharply differing accounts of the outcome of Sunday's ferocious battles in the town, long used by rebels as a supply route from nearby Lebanon into the provincial capital of Homs. The reason this story is important is twofold. One is that truth is always the first casualty of any war, but if the war is involved religion, then truth is a casualty twice over. And if that religion happens to be Islam, well, in Islam, it is considered religious to lie. Muhammad was a liar. Muhammad encouraged lying. Muhammad's God, Allah, admits to lying. And so in Islam, lies are far more common than the truth. The second is, to the degree that there is some shred of evidence here that is actually accurate, if Hezbollah is now fighting alongside Assad regulars, then this war has taken a very, very deadly step, and it's going to get far worse. Speaking of deadly, the World Health Organization says that it appears likely that the novel coronavirus can be passed between people in close contact. This is a problem because the novel coronavirus is very deadly. This comes after the French Health Ministry confirmed that a second man had contracted the virus in a possible case of human-to-human transmission. Now, that's assuming the Saud Muslims are human. 2 more people in Saudi Arabia are also reported to have died from the virus, according to health officials. You know, when you speak of a nationality, and just call somebody Saudi Arabian a nationality is kind of a stretch in and of itself, in that Saudi Arabia is really a modern fiefdom. It is a private estate that was given to the Saud family for their willingness to kill fellow Muslims on behalf of British bribery in World War I. But since the Sauds finance the vast preponderance of Islamic terrorism around the world, you know, there is some justification for questioning whether or not they are human in terms of normal. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. I'm your host, Yahowah. Anytime you're as reprehensible as are the Sauds in their own private fiefdom, nationalizing the oil and gas refineries and distribution systems, can't even say nationalizing because there really is no nation of Saudi Arabia. It is a private estate, a large private estate, but nonetheless, that's what it is. And when you have these robber barons that have stolen other people's assets and then formed a monopoly, and then on top of that used their money to finance terrorism while treating their own people, half of their population, the women in their country, like slaves, there is a reason not to be very fond of them, nor to speak highly of them. Well, anyway, this particular novel coronavirus has come out of Saudi Arabia. 2 more people in Saudi Arabia have reported to have died from the virus. The NCOV, as it's known, causes pneumonia and kidney failure. The World Health Organization officials have expressed concern over the cluster of the cases, particularly with the fact that the 33 confirmed cases throughout Europe and the Middle East with 18 deaths all have a link to Saudi Arabia and to Jordan, and then the spread into Germany, the UK, and France by ostensibly Saudi Arabians coming through from Saudi Arabia and through Jordan, and that's how they're bringing the virus into the country. We talk about religion being a virus, and certainly Islam is a deadly pandemic. There's also diseases that come out of the Islamic world, and they are certainly spreading now in Europe. Most of the concern is the fact that the different clusters seen in multiple countries increasingly support the hypothesis that when there is close personal contact, the coronavirus can transmit from person to person. And with a over 60% mortality rate, this is a serious problem. All of this is important, of course, whether we're talking about anarchy and savagery in the Islamic world or pandemics, because these are all signs of the birth pangs that will precede Yahowah's return. We're dealing with birth pangs that will increase in frequency, they will increase in severity, and terrorism is high on the list, as are deadly pandemics. I was interested to read over the weekend 2 reports from CNN regarding the Boston bombings, the Boston Marathon bombing. It says 2 things, that one in particular, that as we go through this story, that we get selective information from our government, that our government chooses what to report and what to conceal, and it does regularly. If you look at the 9/11 suicide bombings perpetrated by fundamentalist Muslims, most of which were from Saudi Arabia and screaming Allahu Akbar, the U.S. government failed to report the connection to Ramzi Youssef, that failed to report the connection to Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, failed to report the connection to Saudi Arabian funding and the Islamic videos that these suicide bombers made in advance, that they knew about the plot in advance, and gave selective information to the public so that they could create the impression that the government was there to protect the public and that the public ought to rely on their government. Same thing was true when you look at the mass murder at Virginia Tech, where Chu, the perpetrator, wrote of Ishmael's acts, and when the disclosure was of Ishmael's acts, those familiar with Islam immediately recognized that his motivations had Islamic overtures, and so his writings were then barred and concealed. Well, as it turns out, in the Boston Marathon bombing, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev wrote a confession inside of the boat that he was hunkered down in. But does that confession make the media? Did the authorities release the information? No. Selective information is what they want. They don't want anyone to think that this was perpetrated by Muslims acting individually as Muslims because of their religion. So here's the story. Boston Marathon bombing victims were collateral damage in a strike meant as payback for U.S. wars in Muslim lands. So this constant thought is drugged into Muslims that it is appropriate for them to fight wars in non-Islamic lands to impose Allah on the non-Islamic world, but the lands that Islam controls are known as the House of Islam, and therefore there can be no fighting there by infidels. Infidels are considered to be, a non-Muslim is considered to be a disease that has to be removed, exorcised from an Islamic land. So all lands conquered by Muslims must stay forever pure as Muslims, no infidels allowed in, and then the lands not yet conquered by Muslims must be conquered using full means of weapons. Now, what is unbelievable about this, of course, is the hypocrisy of Islam. In an Islamic country, violence is far worse than it is in a non-Islamic country, and that the Muslims don't need non-Muslims to be bringing the war to Muslims when Muslims kill far more Muslims than do non-Muslims. That's why we share these stories of Muslims killing each other in Islamic countries, and they do so in great numbers. So if Muslims want to know the enemy of Muslims, they ought to look at Islam. But anyway, that is how they justify killing, is that they say that Americans go in and invade Islamic countries and kill Islamic women and children. And, well, that is true. America has invaded Islamic country, and it has, as collateral damage, killed Muslim women and children. The difference is that Muslims in Muslim countries actually target women and children, and they kill 100, maybe 200, could be 300 women and children for every woman and child in the Islamic world that Americans have killed. Anyway, what we find is that the surviving suspect wrote this message that justifying his bombing on the U.S. wars in Muslims' lands, and a message that he described inside the boat that he was found hiding. The message that Dzhokhar Shinarif also proclaimed that an attack on one Muslim is an attack on all Muslims. And he said that he would not miss that. By the way, if that's true, then why isn't Dzhokhar at war with Muslims, since Muslims attack Muslims with great regularity? We have no reason in religion, of course. It makes it impossible for a person to think rationally. He said that he would not miss his older brother, Tamerlane, who died after a firefight with police. Whether or not he died after a firefight or died because Dzhokhar actually ran over him is not known for certain, but nonetheless, he is deader than dead. That he would be joining him soon, according to the source who spoke with great trepidation and anonymity regarding the confession inside of the boat. So Dzhokhar is expecting to receive the Islamic promise of paradise as a jihadist who kills on behalf of Allah's cause. So you now know why he planted the bombs. He expects to be rewarded by the Islamic God Allah and the Islamic brothel, whereby jihadists who die killing non-Muslims or peaceful Muslims receive the highest possible rewards. The writing on the inside of the boat dovetails with what Dzhokhar, 19, told investigators questioning him in Boston in the hospital interview. So you have him writing in advance that this is what he was going to do, being known for that's what they were going to do, when in fact he was in conversation with his jihadist mommy. The Russians recognized this is what he was going to do, and then he does it. He tells the world on the confession inside the boat, yep, this is why I did it. I'm a Muslim and I'm killing you because of Islam. And then in his confession to the FBI in the hospital, he says the same thing. I did it because I'm a Muslim. And yet we will call him a lone wolf. We will spend countless millions of dollars trying to find a foreign connection to terrorism as opposed to the religion that he has already confessed to having motivated him to do this. CNN has previously cited officials in reporting that Dzhokhar said U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq were motivating factors behind the April 15th attack, which killed 3 people and wounded 275. You know, the issue there isn't Afghanistan and Iraq. It has nothing to do with Afghanistan and Iraq, and that's what CNN has missed. What Dzhokhar said is that infidel wars in Muslim countries, which tells you that his entire premise, his entire worldview, his entire motivation is Islam. It's not political. It has nothing to do with Afghanistan or Iraq. And yet, even confronted with the confession, even with the evidence right before them, CNN can't make the connection. Dzhokhar suffered gunshot wounds to the head, neck, legs, and hands, is being held in a Bureau of Prison Facilities in Massachusetts. Authorities have said that they believe the brothers acted alone. It's only because authorities in America are unwilling or unable to make a connection to the world's second largest religion. They acted in concert with the second largest, the second most popular religious institution in the world, Islam. They did not act alone. They were simply the pointed end of the stick this time relative to the religion of Islam. And yet the investigators are searching to find out what they could have learned or could have been aided by terrorist groups, including groups overseas. Even though the Boston Marathon bombings have proven that 100% of the dialogue in the week following, before it was known who perpetrated these bombings, was this international terrorism or was this domestic terrorism, and all of the talking heads talked about domestic terrorism. It's Islamic terrorism, and no one seems to even been able to figure that out a month later. We'll return to the last segment of the news on Shattering Myths in a moment. FBI Director Robert Mueller reiterated on Thursday at a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing that the Russian authorities had told the FBI that Tamerlane and his mother appeared to be very religious, and that Tamerlane seemed intent on returning and perhaps participating in jihad. And yet the FBI director, after sending agents out to interview both of the brothers, and after it says it conducted a thorough investigation, found absolutely no ties to terrorism. And therein lies our problem. The FBI is incapable of making the connection between very religious and terrorism. Their only connections are between various terrorist groups. So the FBI, if you have a connection to a symptom, they can identify you. But if your connection is to the source of the problem, they cannot. This is indeed a very, very serious problem that is making America increasingly vulnerable, which is why the FBI's unwillingness, the U.S. government's unwillingness to disclose information whereby the rest of us can at least make informed conclusions is deeply troubling. Because obviously the U.S. government cannot make informed conclusions. They can't make the connections between the source of terrorism and the act of terrorism, instead only being able to connect the various symptoms. There's another story that came out also of the Boston killings. And what we learned is that the night that we had the first of the two gun battles where Watertown, Massachusetts was turned into a shooting arcade, that the first night that there were over 300 rounds of ammunition fired. And, you know, this is presented as a gun battle between the police and the brothers, the Chernerev brothers. Well, one of the brothers, Dzhokhar, did not even have a gun. And the other brother, Tamerlane, all he had was a pistol. And so he was capable of shooting something like 8 or 10 shots, and yet 300 rounds were fired. Now, this is like the night that Dzhokhar is arrested in the boat. He has no weapon of any kind. He is unarmed, and yet police shot 300 rounds of ammunition into that plastic tub. Well, one of the things that came out of this is that the policeman who was shot and nearly killed in that gun battle, he wasn't shot by Tamerlane or by Dzhokhar. Friendly fire. He was shot by fellow police. Now, whether or not it's police or military or paramilitary or what the various agencies were, this particular policeman was in a unoccupied, an unidentified black SUV, as there were hundreds of them that descended upon Watertown and Boston. And one trooper decided that since all black SUVs look the same, that he would begin shooting at it, and he is the one that nearly killed his comrade. The story that has been circulating regarding the AP is part of the big three of Obama's bad week. Remember, he had the issue that should have caused him to be impeached, and if Americans were informed and moral, he would have been impeached over the lies associated with Benghazi. But as we predicted, that story has simply gone away because most Americans just don't care. The president lies to them, doesn't matter to them. The president lies about the reason for his lies. They just don't care. And then, of course, there was the IRS issue. That has largely been swept under the carpet as well, because guess what? The last thing politicians want is attention drawn to the fact that their organizations are tax exempt while they continue to raise taxes on productive corporations and productive individuals. But there is one that still has a little bit of life lingering. What in the world was the Justice Department, which is part of the administration of the current president, always part of the presidential administration, why did they secretly obtain 2 months of telephone records of reporters associated with the Associated Press? What on earth were they doing? Why would they wiretap the Associated Press? There has been no answers coming out of Washington, but the inference is that this April and May wiretaps of more than 100 journalists took place because they stumbled upon a story of the CIA's operations in Yemen. We'll return to Shattering Myths in a moment.